Hi, thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Whitney Finstrom, and I'm with the City of Pittsburgh Office of Management and Budget Community Development Division. And this session public hearing is being conducted for the CARES Act Community Development Block Grant Coronavirus 3 Substantial Amendment. As I said, my name is Whitney Finstrom. I'm Senior Manager of the Office of Management and Budget, and there's my email address if you have any questions. To start out with, I wanted to give you an overview about the CARES Act, what it is. In a brief nutshell, this is in response to the coronavirus crisis that we're still in the midst of. And Congress and the President had agreed to funding through the CARES Act for community development funds to address some of the needs within the city of Pittsburgh and other places throughout the country in order to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus. So the city has received waves of CARES Act funding. This is the third wave of funding. That's the way that Congress had set this up. So we received a wave of funding in the spring. The city received roughly $0.3 million in community development block grant funding, coronavirus funding for the first wave. And that funding was used for everything from business assistance programs to homeless programs, to food bank programs, and a number of other services and outreach efforts, including court landlord-tenant mediation and assistance to young persons. So anyway, this is the third wave of funding. I also wanted to give you an overview in terms of the process that's involved in the CARES Act. And then we'll go into the specific projects and activities that are being recommended for funding for this particular round of funding, the third round. And then a rough timeline to let you know what's coming up in terms of the time frame for this funding. So just to give you a quick overview in terms of the public hearing, typically when we do a consolidated plan or annual action plan, as we call it, to receive federal funding from HUD, we have to do what's called an annual action plan. And that usually entails quite a bit of public outreach, public engagement, and we do a public hearing. In the old days, it was in person, but of course, due to COVID, we're doing these online as we are today. Typically in the past, when we did when there was additional funding that came into the city, we would do what's called a substantial amendment. And that would entail up to 30 days for the document to be put on public display. And we would notice in the paper and so on. We did put a notice in the paper for this public hearing, but due to the COVID-19 changes and regulations, they've reduced the minimum to 5 days, to a 5-day period, and a virtual public hearing in place of an in-person public hearing. So that's what we're conducting today. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Stability Act, or CARES Act, as it's called, is a huge amount of funding that was signed into by the president at the end of March. This is shortly after the crisis was identified. The CARES Act had $2.2 trillion in funding that spread across all different agencies throughout the federal government. But what we're most interested in is the piece related to the city of Pittsburgh and specifically the Community Development Block Grant Program. This gives you kind of the big picture about the CARES Act funds. Initially, $2 billion was allocated, and of that, the city received $8.3 million that went towards various programs to quickly assist in the city. Second round was to states, not to the city. And then the third wave of funding, which is part of the $2 billion, was announced for the city of Pittsburgh in about mid-September. And we received an allocation of roughly $3.1 million. Now, the requirements for the CARES Act funding is that the funds can be used to cover and reimburse allowable costs incurred by the state, such as Pennsylvania or the city of Pittsburgh, regardless of the date the costs were incurred. But those again have to tie back to preventing, preparing for, and responding to coronavirus. So there's an immediacy to this funding, and due to that immediacy, the Congress and HUD allowed for some exemptions in terms of the use of the funds. So for instance, usually there's a cap on the type of public service funding, but they lifted that, the CARES Act, for these years 2019 and 2020. As I said earlier, grantees such as the city of Pittsburgh can use funds to cover or reimburse costs to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19 when those costs comply with CDBG requirements. And there are a number of federal requirements layered on top. So I've gone into the 5-day period of time to comment. We have the document currently on well, it's actually more like a 7-day public display that started yesterday, November 30th, and it'll go through December 7th, next Monday. And I'll show you the link to that, to our website for that document. And then the deadline for these documents is extended to August 16th, 2021. As I mentioned, and it's worth repeating because it's critical for this funding, it's for an immediate response to the COVID-19 crisis. So it's for a range of eligible activities to prevent and respond to the spread of infectious diseases such as the coronavirus. At the same time, it has to meet certain national objectives. And there are 3 main ones that's required by the federal and HUD Community Development Block Grant regulations. Number 1, it has to benefit low and moderate income persons, like those persons who at or below 80% of median income. It has to either that or aid in the prevention of or elimination of slums and blight, and meet an urgent need. So generally, most program activities fall under the first one, benefit low and moderate income persons. In the case of the food banks, we were able to do urgent need due to the critical level of demand for food banks. We put it under the urgent need category, and that required that we could show that there was a declaration of emergency declared, which was done in the city of Pittsburgh by Mayor Peduto, and also there was a national declaration of emergency. So that met the urgent need requirement. When the city of Pittsburgh looked at the first round of funding in terms of which programs and activities seemed to be effective, and also, frankly, where the greatest need was, these are the categories that were identified. We did research, looked at the 211 calls and inquiries, and we found that there was an incredible need for emergency rental assistance. About half the calls that came in over a period of time, particularly over the last 6 months, were for emergency rental assistance. So of the $3.1 million that Congress and HUD allocated for the city of Pittsburgh CDBG 3 funding, $2 million of it will go towards emergency rental assistance. So roughly 2/3 of the funding. In addition, funding is also being allocated towards improving an HVAC system at the Bryn Mawr East Hills development. You can use these funds for to help air circulation, to assist in separating residents, to make sure that there's enough space so people are just safe distance, and also to improve the air quality. So that's what the funding is there for. In addition, food banks are, as everyone knows, there's a incredibly large demand for food at food banks. And so in keeping with that demand and immediacy again of this funding, funds have been allocated to the Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank, an organization that received funds during the first wave of funding for CDBG CD1, for the Jewish Family and Children's Services Food Bank, another organization that also received funding earlier this year, and for 412 Food Rescue. They're a new organization, at least for our purposes, but they've been doing amazing work for a number of years in the city of Pittsburgh. So we'll be working with them on food assistance. And that totals the 3.1 million. That's the allocation that HUD determined the city of Pittsburgh would receive based on a formula they have in terms of poverty levels, population, and so on. So just to give you a quick timeline, as I mentioned, the document, the substantial amendment as we call it, or the document that shows how the funds are going to be expended and the need for the funds, went on display yesterday, and it's currently located at our website. As you can see, the link is right on our screen. It's at pittsburghpa.gov/OMB/public-notices. And please do, if you're interested, look at the site, and it'll give you a summary of this substantial amendment, as we call it, in order to access the 3.1 million that's so critical to address the needs within the city of Pittsburgh to respond to the coronavirus. The document will be on display for roughly 7 days until Monday, December 7th. That's the end of this, what we call public display period. And then immediately afterwards, roughly this month, as quickly as we can, we'll try to submit this document to HUD and supporting documentation. And then what happens next is that HUD reviews our submission and they make a determination, hopefully, that everything's fine. And then we are able to access these resources to work with the groups that were identified. There's more involved with that. We have to contract with the organizations, but the main goal is to try to get these resources out as quickly as possible to meet the needs that exist. That's really the end goal. This is a public hearing, so we do welcome your input virtually, of course, but through our community.development@pittsburghpa.gov email address. And you can provide feedback, questions, and comments. And I would mention that this is funding that's not our usual community development block grant funds. It's specifically targeted towards the coronavirus to address the immediate needs within the city of Pittsburgh. And this is, as far as we know, unless Congress changes it, this is the last wave of funding that we'll receive, at least through the bill that was passed in March, unless there's a new allocation in the new year. But we want to thank you for your time this afternoon. Please stay safe, stay warm, and we do appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.